Appearing tonight, Brian Chesky, Priyanka Chopra Jonas, Hugh Evans, Ethan Hawke, Joshua Caleb Johnson, James McBride, Hillary Rodham Clinton, Ayesha Curry, and Bill Gates. The Atlantic Festival is brought to you through the generous support of Facebook, Genentech, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, Walton Family Foundation, Allstate, Eli Lilly and Company, U.S. Bank, AARP, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, ExxonMobil, John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, Nestle Waters North America, and PayPal.
I'm Jillian White, a managing editor at The Atlantic. It's my pleasure to welcome you back to the Atlantic Festival Idea Stage. Tonight, we'll explore the politics of gender and America's place in the world, and look at the future of vacations and travel. We'll discuss the state of race in America and how to close the chasm of inequality. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoy the program.
Next, welcome Atlantic staff writer James Fallows.
For years, my wife, Deborah, and I have traveled across the country, especially to smaller towns, to learn about those parts of the American story. For a conversation about the future of travel, including to rural areas and small towns, I'm glad to welcome the CEO of Airbnb, Brian Chesky. Thanks so much for joining us. I have some questions about your business in the olden times and in the future times. I wanted to start with one big picture question. Of all the enterprises that have been affected by the pandemic, yours has to be one of the most affected. You're about mobility, and people have not been mobile. What's the main lesson or surprise or discovery that you personally have taken from the experience of the last 8 months or so?
We lost about 80% of our business in 8 weeks, a business we'd spent about a decade building. That was quite surprising. But the thing that may have been even more surprising is what happened next. And what happened next is that people, no matter the circumstances, in the midst of a pandemic, still had a desire to travel. They didn't want to get on planes. They weren't necessarily traveling for business. They didn't want to go to crowded tourist districts, but they did want to get in a car and drive a tank of gas and go to another community and live in that community. And often some of them, were getting homes in Airbnb. And so I think there's just this fundamental desire that people have to travel, to connect, to see the world. And I don't think that anything it can stop it, let alone a pandemic. Obviously, people have to do it responsibly, but there is still a very strong will to see the world. It just has to be done in a much narrower context right now because of the health and safety ramifications.
Something that's fascinating about Airbnb is it's a new way of doing something that people have done for a very long time, of travel, lodging, seeing different parts of the world. And because it's been done for such a long time, there's a large structure of regulations and tax arrangements and the other ways in which the lodging industry has historically been regulated. The fact that you're doing that in a new way has led to some tensions with especially city governments. I understand that the Airbnb has a new way of approaching this, your relationship with city governments in particular. Can you tell us about that?
I mean, one of our guiding principles is that we want to strengthen the communities that we serve. Now, I will say that I started this company with my two friends when I was 26 years old. I had one job before this. And, when I came to Silicon Valley, the culture of Silicon Valley was technology may have been a dictionary definition synonym for the word good. And if you were in the technology industry, you felt like you were making the world a better place. Well, one of the things that happened is our companies got so big that I think something that's occurred to the industry and all of us is that we have a greater responsibility for the activity happening on our platform. That the kind of culture of the Web 1.0, that the internet's an immune system, and if you give the community tools to regulate themselves, is probably not enough, and that you actually have to take more responsibility for the activity happening in your platform. And so that's one of the things that we started doing a number of years ago. And to date, we have more than 400 partnerships with cities. And just to give you an example, we've collected more than $2.5 billion in hotel tax. But the problem is that we're in 100,000 cities, and every city is a relationship. And it can be very difficult to have these relationships on a total one-off basis. And the other thing that's happening is in the pandemic, people aren't just traveling to 20 or 30 cities anymore because they're getting in cars and they're going to smaller communities nearby. And so what we want to do is we want to now be able to scale these relationships and allow thousands of cities to know the activity happening on Airbnb, get the information they need, be able to contact us, and be able to have basic compliance tools. And so what we're creating is this product that we call the City Portal. The City Portal is basically a one-stop shop for a city, a small town, or even a rural community to be able to partner with Airbnb. So again, you would get three things. They would get data and information about the nature of the Airbnb activity in their city. They would be able to contact us and know who to contact for which problems. And the third thing is that we are building some compliance tools so that they can essentially help administer the activity happening in their city.
And is that what stage is that out now? Is that being rolled out?
So we are now launching that, and we're launching that now in I think around 15 cities. So we partnered with about 15 cities to work, and we obviously want to design it with these cities. We don't want to just drop something on hundreds of cities. But our vision is that we're eventually going to roll this out to thousands of cities and communities, anyone that wants to partner with us.
There's one other long-standing challenge of the United States through the centuries of its history, and especially America of this year, of reckoning with racial justice and racial injustice. Because you're dealing with millions of people, some of the people you're exposed to are being discriminatory, whether they're guests or hosts. How is Airbnb dealing with this part of the American challenge now?
Yeah, certainly. Well, the whole idea of Airbnb was kind of a people-to-people platform. The idea is give people the power and they can do great things. And so that is mostly true. The unfortunate thing is so long as discrimination exists in the world, it also exists on our platform. And a number of years ago, in 2016, this was brought to our attention that there was some systemic racism happening on our platform. And so we worked really closely with civil rights groups. We've done a lot of work. We make every single person who joins Airbnb sign the Airbnb Community Compact, Community Commitment, which essentially means that you will pledge not to discriminate against others. Believe it or not, 1.3 million people have chosen not to sign that commitment, and they've left our platform for good reason, or thankfully they left our platform given they aren't committed to the values we're committed to. But more recently, we took a bigger step. We worked with Rashad Robinson and Color of Change, which is the largest online civil rights group in the United States. And we created a project called Project Lighthouse. And the idea of Project Lighthouse was to be able to measure how much discrimination is actually happening on Airbnb. And so we worked with Color of Change and leading privacy rights groups to create a first-of-its-kind partnership in technology. The idea is this. We're going to basically collect, anonymized perceived race information, and we had to work with civil rights groups and privacy groups to do this in a very responsible way. And we are using this to try to measure how much systemic discrimination people are experiencing in Airbnb. And then once we actually can measure it, we can improve and design our product to actually reduce the amount of bias happening on our platform. I think this is going to be a long, long challenge. This is not something that I'm expecting us to change overnight. So long as there's discrimination in the world, it will probably exist on Airbnb. But our challenge is to make sure that the gates inside of Airbnb are more inclusive and you have a greater sense of belonging than the gates outside of Airbnb. And hopefully we can lead the way forward. And then if we learn something and we make some improvements, maybe we can open source some of those learnings to other companies. So that's essentially the idea.
So one follow-up about that. You mentioned earlier the sort of change in consciousness of your peers in the tech industry of recognizing there are downsides to new ways of doing things in addition to pluses. Do you have the sense that most of your peers share your awareness that they have to think about the racial effects of their tools and the politically divisive effects?
Well, I mean, the tech industry is thousands and thousands of companies, so it will be hard for me to generalize too much, but I will say that I think there's been a broad reckoning and awakening in the tech industry. And I do think that I can't speak for everyone. I can't say where they all are, but I think the general mindset of the culture is totally different than it was more than a decade ago when I came here. I think it is a very serious topic that comes up in numerous conversations. And I do see leaders taking it very seriously. And but that doesn't mean we're doing enough. And so I often ask myself, years from now, when we look back on ourselves today, will we say we did enough, or will we feel like we should have done more sooner? And very rarely will you be able to look yourself in the mirror, be honest, and say that you're not going to say, wow, I was too bold, or I was doing just enough. And so that is a constant reminder that we could be doing more. And I think history's watching.
Thank you for that. Back to the travel question now. You mentioned earlier that people want to travel, but they're doing it in different ways. They're driving as opposed to flying. They're traveling domestically as opposed to internationally. When Deb and I were traveling, we often heard in places like Fresno or Allentown, PA, or Duluth, Minnesota, or Greenville, South Carolina, or Bend, Oregon, that people would sooner or later recognize the virtues of operating from smaller, less expensive places as opposed to the Bay Area or New York City or LA. Are you seeing some analog to that in travel to rural areas, to smaller towns? What's happening now, and do you think it will be a lasting change?
We're seeing two big trends in travel. The first trend in travel is what I would call essentially travel redistribution. It used to be that hundreds of millions of people would go to just a few big cities. In the United States, those would be New York City, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Miami, Chicago, and they would go to the tourist districts and they'd visit really popular landmarks. What you end up having is something that was labeled over tourism. A lot of people concentrating in a very small area. Because people aren't flying, they don't want to be in crowds and lines, mostly for health reasons, they're dispersing. The travel is being redistributed to small communities, but they're not going to any one community. And so what's happening is they're being much more spread out. And so now 60% of our business on Airbnb, a business that used to be mostly urban, it used to be 80% urban many years ago, is now 60% non-urban. So even most of Airbnb is non-urban because people are living in less defined areas. The other trend we're seeing is traveling and living starting to blur together. It used to be for many people, they live one place and they travel a couple nights here and there for business if they were so fortunate. And if they were fortunate and privileged enough to be able to take a vacation, they take 1 or 2 weeks vacation. What we're starting to see are millions of people for whom traveling and living is blurring. They are leaving their area and they want to get a house somewhere else. Maybe they're in a city and they want to get out in the country. Maybe they're a bunch of college kids, their college isn't back on campus and they don't want to live home with mom and dad, so they're getting an Airbnb with a bunch of friends in some other city. Maybe they want to be closer to their family, but they don't want to actually live with their family, so they're getting a home nearby. So there's all these use cases where traveling and living are blurring and the length of stay is increasing to a week, a month, or even a couple months at a time. That's a whole new use case that really didn't exist in a really, really big way before the pandemic like it does today.
Of course, none of us can tell which things are phenomena and which are long-term trends, but what is Airbnb's business bet about what the new normal is going to be like a couple of years from now, whether these trends will continue?
It's a great question, and nobody knows, so you're asking me to try to predict the future, and that's always a slightly precarious proposition. But let me tell you what I think is what seems to might play out. Clearly, the world we're living in today is not the rest of history. That's clear. But we also know that the world's never going back to the way it was. I know travel is never going back to the way it was in January. Change goes forward. Change does not go backward. But just because the world and travel is never going back to the way it was in January doesn't mean the travel industry is doomed or people participating in are doomed. I think what's going to happen is the genie's out of the bottle a little bit on small communities, small destinations, on people visiting national parks. There's 400 national parks, and the average American is a tank away from a national park and has never visited one. So there's a whole new part of the world I think people are discovering. The rural America, small town America, national parks. And it's not like people didn't know these places exist. They just didn't really travel there. In fact, there's often not hotels in these areas. But I think there's going to be a little bit of a democratization of travel, and people will go back to cities. They will go back to tourist districts. It's just that when they go back, it's going to be more of a concentrated balance. They're not going to just go back to urban areas. They're not going to just go back to resorts. And I think that's ultimately probably for the best of almost all communities.
Here's a final quick question. Airbnb has been frequently in the news about the possibility of an IPO. It was going to happen this year. It was going to happen not this year. It was going to happen before or after the election. What should we watch for in the news?
Well, we filed our S1 registration statement with the Securities and Exchange Commission. That puts me in a quiet period, which means I can't say very much about it. But what I can say is what I said previously, which is we were planning to go public before the pandemic. Then suddenly, obviously, COVID-19 hit. We put the S1 on the shelf. But recently, we dusted off. We filed it. And when the market's ready for Airbnb public, we'll be ready.
Great. Well, Brian Chesky, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you very much.
Here's Atlantic Live contributor and the host of WNYC's All of It, Allison Stewart.
Next month, Showtime will debut the series The Good Lord Bird, based on the National Book Award-winning novel of the same name by James McBride. It's the story of abolitionist John Brown, who led a small group to raid a federal armory in Harper's Ferry. The idea was to arm enslaved people and end slavery. In this clip, John Brown, played by Ethan Hawke, is fired up and ready to take on his opponents with his ragtag group, which includes a young person named Onion, who John thinks is a girl, but who isn't.
Captain Pate, this is Osawatomie John Brown, here on behalf of the emancipation of all God's creation. Stop it, Brown! Your salvation is in doubt, lest you surrender my sons! Go to hell, you loon! Go to hell! You and your men are lying in the mud with the harlot of slavery! All right, Owen, let's sneak down to that ravine, soften them up, then take them. You take your men left, I'll take mine right. Robert, Onion, you stay here and guard the horses.
Now, yours truly was happy to guard the horses. Captain Shore's attack had given away our positions. And pretty soon, me and Bob was in the hothouse.
I'm joined by actors Ethan Hawke, Joshua Johnson, and author James McBride. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
So, Ethan, I know you were a big fan of this novel. When you read the novel, The Good Lord Bird, how did it make you think about our country's history differently? And then how did you apply that to your portrayal of John Brown?
Well, what a fun question. I think there was something about The Good Lord Bird that let me in to history. The novel is so funny, and Onion is so lovable as a character. The idea of choosing to tell this story from the point of view of a young man pretending to be a woman who's doesn't really have any political agenda but to stay alive somehow lets in humor and lets in light and lets in love. And it makes you see all these really painful things in a way that you can look at, because you just, by making it about gender and making it about race, it stops being about either one and becomes about humanity. And it's hard to say, when you fall in love, it's hard to say why. I finished the book. I just wanted everyone in the world to read it. You know that feeling? I wanted to give it to every friend. I wanted every checkout line at 7-Eleven to have the book there. And this country has such a difficult time talking about race and has such a difficult time talking about our past. It's so hurtful and it's so scary. And this book just is like a bazooka of love. And it lets you talk about it. It lets you go, man, this stuff happened. And it sees it from this human point of view. And so I just wanted to share it.
So, James, you've said when thinking about slavery in this country, we need to think about it as a web and the interconnectedness of us all. How so?
Well, I like the bazooka metaphor better, actually, but we're all connected. I mean, history connects us. And slavery was a part of American life that was part of the economic engine of life. Similarly to the way when we drive in cars now, we're committing the kind of ecological genocide that just simply has to stop. Slavery had to end, and John Brown was the agent, really, that had an enormous amount to do with it. So, telling this story through the eyes of a boy who had to act like he was a girl in order to stay alive, added a certain sense of innocence to it, and also an innocence in terms of this young man's ability to see the web of relationships that existed and how intertwined they were. Because, it's hard to unravel these racial stereotypes and relationships that we have all been privy to and been victim of, all of us, for centuries. So that's the kind of the professorial look of the matter.
So Joshua, John Brown mishears Onion's name and assumes that Onion's a girl. And Onion goes with it. And that's a choice. And throughout the entire series, your character has to make a lot of choices. When you think about the motivation, what is motivating Onion in her choices?
Onion's motivation when it comes to the choices throughout, most of the beginning of the series, I say, is just to purely survive. And that's why he goes with what John Brown says, is because he doesn't know what's going to happen if he tells John Brown his quote unquote true nature, that he's actually a boy, and if John Brown's going to kill him or what's really going to happen. But then I think later on in the series, his choices are motivated about what's doing right and doing right by the captain. I think because once he grows that bond with John Brown and the bond with all the boys, he feels almost a sense of responsibility and he feels accountable for what's going to happen to them. And so he makes choices according to that.
Nathan, John Brown doesn't really have choices. He in his mind, he doesn't. He has to do this. It's God telling him this is his mission. This is why he was put on this earth. And it can make him seem a little unhinged sometimes, even if he's right about big picture things. So how did you play that idea of like he's a little unhinged, but he's also correct?
I don't know about you or other people, but I've met a few do-gooders in my life. I've had a few people in my life that if you really want to do well for people, you have to not think like society thinks. You have to have the courage of your own convictions, and that makes you seem crazy. Society wants us all to live in a box and eat hamburgers and not pay attention and watch, dumb TV and not ask anything and buy as much as possible, right? A real radical wants to break the box and is a great, people call John Brown crazy all the time because he killed people. And his answer was slavery is killing hundreds of thousands of people. It's torturing children. The society says that's sane and me doing something about it is insane. Well, then I want to be insane. I don't believe in that as a definition of sanity. And it takes a strong person, whether we're talking about just and unjust laws, these are big, complicated ideas, because it's talking about rewriting what the parameters are, and it takes real courage to do that. And I think to do it, you have to be a little bit crazy. Because if you're normal, you just want other people to like you. Most of us just want to eat and have other people like us, and John's a little more of himself.
James, how did you want to use humor in this story that has dark corners?
Well, I want to eat and make most people like me. That's why I did humor.
Me too.
You just laid it out. Look, these stories are hard to tell. This kind of history is really difficult to relate to a viewer or to a reader. But we do funny things. And humor allows a lot of room for someone to say, I made a mistake, or I'm stupid, or I did something wrong. And humor takes us off the hook. And it also lets us see the world in a real way that gives us room to say, maybe I'm not right here. And even if we agree to disagree, at least humor allows reason and discourse into the room. And so that's why I think humor is effective. And I try very hard to put as much in this book and in this series. Is very funny. It's funny in a macabre way, but people will find a lot of humor in it.
You have a unique take on Frederick Douglass.
Well, people have asked me.
He's a bit of a ladies' man. He's a dandy.
Well, he was a dandy fellow.
Loves the sound of his own voice.
Look, we didn't have to take any liberties with the humor in Frederick Douglass's life, because the truth is he was married to a black woman and he had a white mistress living with him. And that doesn't work now. So if you're doing a piece of caricature, look, you can't. David Diggs said it very well, and his portrayal of Frederick Douglass was extraordinary, and Blumhouse should be commended for allowing him that liberty to do it. He said he doesn't really like idols. He's played them a lot in his career, and he thinks the best way to show them is to show the full breadth of that person. So, we did that with Frederick Douglass. Of course, we love and admire him for what he was, for what he did. And he and John Brown were very close friends. However, when it came time to shooting and fighting for real physically, Frederick Douglass was just not the man to do that. And he said as much. That doesn't make him any less of a hero or less of a man. It just provided some fodder for us.
I interviewed David a couple months ago on an entirely different project, but he just wanted to talk about this project, Good Lord Bird. And this is what he said. He said that, Ethan, you'd gone to see him in White Noise. And he said, we had coffee afterwards, and he gave me a copy of The Good Lord Bird. You won't go around giving copies. And he said, quote, I think you should play Frederick Douglass in this if you're into it, but I want to make sure that you love the story, and that's it, a particular take on Frederick Douglass, and I want to make sure you're okay with it. And I read the book in the next few days, was obsessed. It was so funny. I don't know, it's brilliant. I think James McBride is incredible. Getting to work with Ethan was amazing. And young Joshua, who plays Onion, what a fantastic young actor. So, a couple things there. Joshua, this is a big role for you. What is something that you learn on the set that you think you'll take with you for the rest of your career?
I think really being able to work with so many veteran actors and just really being able to work on a set every single day. And I've learned so much, not just about acting, but how to conduct myself on a set, and working with Ethan and working with people like Orlando Jones, Steve Zahn, David Morris, all those people, they taught me so much about just the in-depth and like little hints and tips and tricks on how to really make your character go from here to the next level. And so I'm just really grateful. And I think I learned more in 5 months than an average person would learn in 10 years about acting.
Ethan, I have an actor's question for you. How did you take care of your voice? Because you have to do a lot of projecting, a lot of screaming. It's a whole different register of your voice. How did you take care of your voice, and how did you come up with John Brown's voice?
It's such a, it's this job, I like to say, it took me 50 years of life to be ready to play this part. I used everything I've learned about performance in some aspect was required for this role. And I called James up. I drove up to Lake Placid before we started to try to visit John Brown's grave. It's just if you're going to stand in somebody's shoes, I feel like you have to take off your hat, and admit you're not them, invite them to join you, whatever. I don't know if it makes sense to you, but I just felt like there can be a sense of inadequacy if you try to step and pretend to be a great human being, and so you have to kind of honor it. And I went there and I was looking around and I kept thinking, what does this man sound like? What did he sound like? Look at his tombstone, and you can read his writing, and I underlined all the parts in McBride's book where he talked about what he sounded like, and I called James up and I said, what do you mean he sounds like high timber? I can't find a high timber, a pine tree. And it sounded good, but I did good when I read it, but I couldn't make it come out of my voice. And James laughed. He said, I think I got that wrong, or I'm paraphrasing you, but you said, I think maybe it's a deeper tone, like now that you're talking. And when he gave me permission to do that, I really heard my grandfather. My grandfather was civil rights activist in West Texas when it was not cool, and he believed in the unwavering equality of mankind, and he wouldn't shut up about it. He talked about it, and he shouted at you all the time. I'd be like a little kid, and he'd say, Jimmy Carter. I don't know who Jimmy Carter is. I don't know what a poll tax is. I don't know about gerrymandering. I don't, and he would just shout at you because he'd lived through the Depression. He'd seen some really bad things, and he was upset. and he shouted at people, especially young people. And I just took that and ran with it. I just found his voice, and I had no trouble with my voice. Often I have trouble with my voice with performance because you're always asking it to shape-shift out of your comfort zone. You're trying to find a character's voice that helps you have access to it. But this one was right in the pocket for me. I just loved it.
And James, before I let you all go, I'm curious, how do you think the past year, what this country's gone through, how could that affect the way someone takes in the Good Lord Bird? Or how do you hope it might affect the way someone
Well, the answer to that is very simple. John Brown spent the last year and a half of his life at war with American society, ending with his attack on Harper's Ferry with 19 others, one of whom I'm proud to say was an Oberlin College student. He was in jail for 6 weeks before he was hanged. And John Brown, while he was in jail, he wrote letters to his friends and associates and to newspaper editors about the business of slavery. And he did more with his pen in those 6 weeks while he was in prison than he ever did with a gun or a knife. So, the blood has already been shed. The path has already been cut. We simply need to just put our hats on and walk down the road. And that's really the purpose of the Good Lord Bird. I feel John Brown would be dismayed to see that we're at each other's throats now because of what had happened in an election 4 years ago. I think he'd be delighted to see what these young people have done and are doing now to make things, to bring us in the right direction. We really need to right ourselves quickly. This is one antidote to patch things up a bit so we can deal with some other things that are equally, if not more important, which like the ecology and the economic and the climate change that is really, really starting. We have to get ourselves together. And that's the point of the Good Lord Bird, to show us that it's been done already. The war's over. Let's move ahead peacefully. The lives have already been lost. There's no need to sacrifice more.
Ethan Hawke, James McBride, and Joshua Caleb Johnson, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
The Good Lord Bird will debut on Showtime on October 4th.
The Atlantic Festival is brought to you through the generous support of Facebook, Genentech, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, Walton Family Foundation, Allstate, Eli Lilly and Company, U.S. Bank, AARP, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, ExxonMobil, John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, Nestle Waters North America, and PayPal. Next, Derek Thompson, a staff writer at The Atlantic.
There are nearly 3,000 billionaires in the world. Do they hang on to all their riches, or do they share it for the greater good? Can the wealthiest people in the world put an end to extreme poverty? Joining me now to help answer these questions is Hugh Evans, the CEO of Global Citizen, and actor and Global Citizen ambassador Priyanka Chopra Jonas. Thank you both for being here. Hugh, let's start with you. What is Global Citizen, and what are you trying to do?
Global Citizen, and firstly, thank you, Derek, and thank you to the Atlantic Festival for having Priyanka and I with you today. Global Citizen is a worldwide movement committed to the eradication of extreme poverty by 2030. And our movement really is focused on mobilizing people who self-identify not as citizens of a member of a state or a tribe or a nation, but as members of the human race, and people who are prepared to act on that belief to tackle our world's greatest challenges. So far, our movement has over 10 million members around the world, people who take action for the eradication of extreme poverty. And in the last 10 years, since we were founded, over $50 billion has been announced on Global Citizen stages in support of poverty alleviation efforts, whether that's the empowerment of girls and women, whether that's education, water and sanitation, food security, or environmental sustainability. This is really at the heart of Global Citizen's mission, mobilizing citizens to call on world leaders to make multi-billion-dollar pledges to achieve the end of extreme poverty by 2030.
Priyanka, you have a very busy career outside of the work you're doing with Global Citizen. What drew you to this endeavor?
The fact that, first of all, again, hi, Derek, and hi, Atlantic Fest. Thank you for having us. I think what drew me to Global Citizen was the fact that every single person around the world can create a movement, and anyone who feels responsible for the rest of the world can tangibly do something, can be part of something which is so large and mobilizes so many people to do so much more. It's been said before, with privilege comes responsibility, right? And I think that is so true, that it's really important that people create larger tables for those who have not had a seat on that table. And that is going to require mobilizing, people with privilege, which could be, my mother used to tell me when I was a kid that no matter where you are in the world and no matter where off that you are, somebody's worse off than you. And when you think about people who live in extreme poverty, that's unimaginable. The basic rights of food, clean water, and just education doesn't exist in a large diaspora around the world. And it's the responsibility of countries and individuals with privilege to be able to contribute to eradicating that.
Thank you. And Hugh, back to you. How exactly does this platform enable people to participate in a global effort to get, say, billionaires to donate their money or to help eradicate global poverty? How exactly are people using this platform and this movement?
Well, one of our most important initiatives that we launched together with Priyanka is called Give While You Live. And this is a campaign that we launched also in partnership with Forbes magazine, but it's focused on encouraging the world's ultra high net worth community. As you mentioned, the almost 3,000 billionaires on the planet with a collective net worth of over $10 trillion to actually give their wealth while they're still alive. Because what we've seen in the past based on wealth rankings, and Forbes, has over 40 years as the gold standard track record of measuring this, we've seen that many ultra high net worth individuals have pledged their money to a donor advised fund or to a foundation, and it sits there stagnant, earning interest, and doesn't actually have an impact. And so when we launched this campaign, we said we want to change the way we measure philanthropy as actually not just dollars that have been pledged to a foundation, because that just makes the foundation wealthy, but actually, is it getting to the end recipient? Is it getting to the poorest of the poor or to a great charity that is at the forefront of making a difference? Because if you can measure that, you can change the world. And so that's why we worked with Forbes this year to change the way the philanthropic ranking worked. And then we've been mobilizing our Global Citizen members to call on them to encourage other philanthropists to step up. And we're starting to see more and more wealth managers consider the new Forbes ranking as the gold standard of what they should be doing when they consider their philanthropy in the future, with the ultimate goal being that more people will give to tackle the world's biggest problems right now.
Priyanka, I am personally, as a journalist, extremely interested in persuasion and figuring out not just how to change people's minds with new information, but how to motivate them to do more good, to help assist in the global sort of process of producing progress. How have you found, as a Global Citizen ambassador, how have you found success in pushing people to change their minds about this issue? What works to get people to really see the scale of this problem and the way that they can participate in solving extreme poverty in the world?
I think the biggest thing that I have seen, especially with Global Citizen, is that power is in numbers. When you have a sheer amount of people around the world writing into heads of states or leadership or heads of large conglomerates to be able to give large amounts of money, donate large amounts of money for the world's most pressing problems. I mean, we need it more now than ever. We're not only going through a health crisis, we're going through an education crisis, job crisis, climate crisis, racial justice crisis. It is this moment that we need to make sure that we get so much more to be able to end the world's problems, or at least contribute in trying to fix it for the next generation. And the urgency is so pressing that the only way to do it is to have people mobilized in large numbers, which Global Citizen does so well. Each and every one of us as citizens of the world have a responsibility, and we can use our voices to make sure that we hold people accountable.
It's just a straightforward fact that no billionaire can conceivably spend all of his or her money in their lifetime. And that would at least lead me to think that it would be relatively straightforward to persuade them to give a lot of their money away. But Hugh, is there a valid argument that you've heard on the part of billionaires that there are other ways that their money can be more useful? That yes, they say maybe donating money to charities and trying to end extreme poverty, that's a priority. But do some of them say there are other priorities and I want to invest in those?
Well, I mean, there's a starting point that some ultra high net worth individuals don't want to give any money away to anyone. And their argument is often that they believe that either they earned it or that they have created enough jobs for people and that job creation alone is their contribution. That's the strongest argument I've ever heard. But, my view is that when you are worth tens of billions of dollars and you can't possibly buy another Ferrari or another Porsche, another Lamborghini or another island, then you have this moral responsibility to give back. And I think that moral responsibility, most people would agree, particularly Americans who are some of the most generous people on the planet, that everyone should be giving something to their neighbor. And whether that means that you're giving to support your local college or your alma mater, or you're giving to support a hospital, or you're giving abroad to support the most vulnerable wherever they may be on this planet. Everyone, I think, believes that you can't ignore the immense suffering. And I think Priyanka put it so well earlier when she said that right now the world is facing so many parallel crises at once. When you've got not just a health crisis with COVID, but an enormous economic crisis with so many people out of work, coupled with an education crisis and the climate crisis, as we're seeing in Northern California with the bushfires, there's so much need on the planet right now. And when that need is accentuated, it actually gives people the opportunity to step into that and provide leadership. And I think people are looking for leadership, whether it's from government or from the private sector, in this case, from ultra high net worth individuals who can step into that void and say, you know what, I'm going to use the immense wealth that I've been given for good, and I'm going to apply it and make a real impact in this world, not just once I die, but right now.
Priyanka, I wonder when you're having conversations at organizations, you're having conversations at places like Davos, I wonder if people sometimes come up to you and say the problems that you're trying to solve, like say extreme poverty, aren't just problems of money. They're matters of institutions. We can't end global poverty just by having rich people give a little bit more money to charity. It's more complicated than that. We have to look at the problem of reforming institutions in low-income countries. How do you carry on with that sort of conversation when they're essentially complexifying this argument for just giving money away?
It is complicated, Derek. You're right. And they would probably be right in saying that. But just because it is a complex problem, do we not even take one step in that direction? Do we just let it be complicated? I think giving large amounts of money is what will help alleviate the problem at least. And yes, there is a lot of complications that will have to be sorted, reforms that need to be created, and people will work towards that. We are working towards that as global citizens for sure. We push governments to change laws. We push rule makers and lawmakers to be able to create opportunity. So everything has to go hand in hand. But because the need is so urgent right now, I think it's extremely important to implore people who are high net worth individuals to impart with a little bit of their wealth. I'm not a billionaire, but I'm very proud to be able to tell my children that I have done that bit. And every single person who has the privilege to have a home, have be able to feed their families and have the luxury of having security in a time where it's so unprecedented. I think that's our privilege, to take care of someone or a part of society that we can better. And I think that recognition is a social responsibility, which Hugh was talking about, that is on high net individuals in a big way, but it's also on each and every one of us as citizens of the world.
Priyanka, I'm interested, you went to the heart of global capitalism at the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier to make this pitch. How was that pitch received? What did you hear after you spoke to that extremely high net worth audience, an important audience, about this message?
I mean, I have to say, and you can corroborate this a little bit more with me, but I have to say that we got a lot of positive feedback. We got a lot of people curious, and we got a lot of contributions. And I think that it was overall an extremely successful trip, even though it could always get better.
Yeah, and I think Priyanka's exactly right. We've seen an enormous response from ultra-high net worth individuals since the World Economic Forum. For example, the Wallace Global Fund decided to be part of this campaign, and they've announced that they're going to be giving away 20% of their corpus during this financial year, which is an extraordinary undertaking, and it's the first time they've done so as a result of Give While You Live. We also heard a really interesting story the other day. We had a phone call from a wealth manager who said that one of his ultra high net worth clients only scored a 1, which is the lowest ranking on our new ranking. And this particular client said he never wants to score a 1 ever again. And if he scores a 1 next year, he's going to be extremely disappointed and may fire that firm. So I think that this is an example of where a ranking like this is changing culture. It's actually encouraging billionaires to give more. That's exactly what we'd hoped would happen. You know, we're seeing great billionaires like Mackenzie Bezos Scott step up, and she just made a whole bunch of anonymous gifts this year, which will show through in her ranking next year. We also saw that great article you may have seen the other day, Chuck Feeney, who was the billionaire founder of Duty Free. He officially filed for bankruptcy this week because he wanted to be one of the first billionaires that gave away all of his money by the time he died, and he officially succeeded in that this past week, which is an extraordinary example of generosity. Now, we're not expecting every billionaire to be as generous as Chuck Feeney, but even someone like Warren Buffett scored a perfect 5 ranking because he's given so much away. So I think if everyone gave like Warren Buffett or Chuck Feeney, we would solve extreme poverty 10 times over. And so these are not, and to your point earlier around institutions, you can actually invest money into strengthening institutions. If you want to fight COVID, the best way is to strengthen the health system, which itself is an institution, or to reform it politically. And we encourage people to advocate for political reform because that's a great way to strengthen democracy. All of these things work hand in hand.
That's great. Hugh Evans, Priyanka Chopra Jonas, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us, Derek. Thank you.
And now an Atlantic Ideas File with Danielle Allen.
Why do I love the U.S. Constitution? This instrument formally converted the worth of my great-great-grandfather, Sidiphus, into 3/5 that of a free person. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution determined that representation in Congress and direct taxation would be apportioned to the states by adding up the whole number of the people plus 3/5 of all other persons, meaning enslaved persons, but excluding Indians not taxed. My great-great-grandfather was among the enslaved. Given the crimes against humanity written into the Constitution, because compromise was necessary to form a union, I had better come up with a rock-solid explanation for my love of that document. The best that can be said about the compromises regarding slavery that also helped the Constitutional Convention achieve unanimity is this. Those who knew enslavement was wrong, people like Benjamin Franklin and James Wilson, but who nonetheless accepted the compromises, believed they were choosing a path that would lead inexorably, if incrementally, to freedom for all. They understood themselves to be choosing freedom for some over freedom for none. So why then do I love the Constitution? I love it for its practical leadership. I love it because it is the world's greatest teaching document for one part of the story of freedom. The question of how free and equal citizens check and channel power, both to protect themselves from domination by one another and to secure their mutual protection from external forces that might seek their domination. It's the story of how ambition can be made to check ambition.
our modern-day global space race. Dr. England Go with Haley Romer.
Supercomputers have hit certain thresholds over time.
Gigascale, terascale, petascale, soon we'll have exascale.
Exascale computing is the next frontier of high-performance computing.
What is exa? Exa means 10 to the 18th, or a billion operations per second.
That's one with 18 zeros after it.
If you add all the top 500 supercomputers that are available in the world today, you get to an exascale.
So this is kind of crazy, right, when you think about it.
Once you have the ability to simulate an exascale level, then you can find more answers to questions because you really haven't had the ability to model at that level.
Of course, other countries are working on the same research because whoever gets there first has the keys to innovation and discovery.
A patient that might have cancer, for example,
would walk into the doctor, get tissue samples, get the DNA sequence.
And all of that gets pushed into a system that basically would be able to match your genome profile to hundreds of thousands of other people's profiles. And the doctor would be able to tell you the best outcome is really to go with this specific treatment.
Another great application is in the area of weather forecasting, weather prediction.
The higher resolution you get, the more accurate your weather prediction is.
A far more precise weather model can have a significant impact on catastrophic events and the response we can put in place to avoid them.
The use case for exascale in space research is one of the most exciting ones that we have.
With models and simulations of worlds that we cannot see visibly, coupling that in with what we can see,
you can start to get a better sense of
how the universe is born.
Humankind has an insatiable curiosity to understand how things work, how we work, how our world around us works.
We're at the point where high-performance computing technology could really make a breakthrough.
It's really the space race of this century.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Haley Romer, publisher of The Atlantic, and I'm here tonight with Dr. Eng Lim Go, Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of AI at Hewlett Packard Enterprise, the global leader in supercomputing. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Go, and welcome.
Thank you, Haley. Thank you for having me.
I'm very excited to have you here and excited to talk a little bit about supercomputing and the video that we just saw. Dr. Go, the role technology is playing in solving some of our biggest challenges right now cannot be overstated. You're an expert in AI specifically, and you talk a lot about supercomputers. Can you tell us what exactly supercomputing is?
Imagine a room tens of thousands of square feet big, right, full of computers. But the key difference is a supercomputer. All these computers in this tens of thousands square feet room is bound together by a very, very high performance network. The goal is to be able to solve one problem across all those computers so that we can take a very complex problem that typically take weeks to solve. We hope to bring it down to minutes, or sometimes even seconds.
Obviously, there are so many urgent issues that we are dealing with as a society right now, COVID-19 being chief among them, and finding a vaccine specifically. I think the whole world is watching very closely. We've been talking a lot about this during the Atlantic Festival, in fact. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what role are supercomputers playing in the vaccine research for COVID-19?
Oh, very much so, right? Because this is the pertinent problem for us here. So two areas, right, where supercomputers have been brought together to try and work on for COVID-19. One is drug discovery, right? What supercomputers do there is to go through all the libraries, huge library of all the different kinds of drugs and test it digitally with the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19. And then pre-select them, filter them, and those that are selected are then sent for preclinical trials and hopefully clinical trials. That's one area. Then vaccine is the other area. Supercomputers are used to run analysis of the gene expression data of the volunteers of clinical trials. So when the vaccine is injected, genes are expressed, and then we use this, right, and AI to run through to figure out and try and predict ahead of time the efficacy of the vaccine, or sometimes even side effects.
So it's fascinating to hear how supercomputers are being put to work for a vaccine. And of course, we are, though, facing so many other issues today, so many other urgent issues, including the climate crisis. Naturally, we're seeing what's happening out west with the wildfires, and we're seeing all of the hurricanes in the southern United States recently. How are supercomputers being put to work to help solve some of those challenges?
Yeah, this is another great question, right? Supercomputers should be applied for the most pertinent problems facing us. So wildfires, we still have some ways to go. For hurricane prediction, especially in the landfall of hurricane, right, where the destruction mostly occurs, we've been working on it for decades. Yeah, the goal is to use supercomputers with all the math and features being put in the calculations to try and predict landfall of hurricanes better.
Fascinating. Okay, so this is all supercomputing that we're talking about and supercomputing today. In the video that we saw, we're talking about getting to exascale, which is the next phase in supercomputing. For us laymen, can you explain a little bit why this is important and where we are on the journey to exascale?
Let's use the example of the hurricane, right? So in the 1970s, we were predicting hurricane landfall to the accuracy of about 200 miles, right? By the year 2000, 30 years on, we shrank it down, tightened it to 100 miles. And 20 years later and to today, right, we are predicting about 50 miles accuracy. We need to keep tightening that, right, so that we give better and better prediction to the residents of the areas where the hurricane will be landing. So this is where exascale comes in, right? Every time we tighten it to become more and more accurate, we have to put more math, more features, more calculation, more physics into the models. But in order for the models to run fast enough, we need to back it up with supercomputers, right? No point having a supercomputer that takes 2 days to calculate something that we want to give a prediction for 2 days out.
That's great. So, Dr. Go, when exactly will we achieve exascale?
Oh, very soon, actually, right? We've been contracted by the Department of Energy for the HPE Cray supercomputer to be delivered next year, by the year 2021.
And supercomputing, or exascale as we know it, is not simply just one company or one country. This is a worldwide movement, right? There is, in fact, Exascale Day. Maybe tell us when that day is so we can all look out to celebrate.
It's October 18th, right? And there's a reason for October 18th. It is because exascale is 10 to the power 18, which means a billion calculations per second, right? That's 18 zeros, right? So Exascale Day is when the industry can come together in anticipation for when we actually cross the 18-0 mark. We are getting there, and therefore we've marked Exascale Day as October 18 to get the industry together to start working on the math and the calculations and the algorithms to run on these exascale supercomputers when it comes.
Thinking back to the video, it said that whoever gets to exascale first will hold the keys to what innovation and discovery looks like in the future. And it seems as though that's really true. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Go.
Thank you. Great questions. Yeah. Thank you.
Here is The Atlantic's editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg.
Our next guest knows all too well that the fight for women's equality is not complete. She recently wrote a piece for The Atlantic about the struggle for women's equality and empowerment, a piece that, by the way, you can find right now in the lead position on our homepage at theatlantic.com. As the first woman nominated as a major party candidate for president, not to mention a former Secretary of State, Senator, and First Lady, she is the first to say that there is more work to do on this front. It's my pleasure to welcome Hillary Rodham Clinton back to the Atlantic Festival. Good evening, Secretary Clinton. Nice to see you.
Good evening. It's great to be with you.
Great. We're very happy to have you back at this all-digital, and as I said earlier in the festival, we hope the last all-digital festival that we're doing, but we'll see.
Let's hope so.
I wanted to, I hope so too. Let's turn first to the subject of the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. More than almost anyone on the planet, you're responsible for the fact that we know who she is and that she's become this legendary figure. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you saw all those years ago that made you think this is a person that your husband should nominate to serve on the Supreme Court. Maybe you can just share some recollections about her in that period.
Well, Jeff, I followed her groundbreaking legal work as a lawyer, as a law professor, and I was really impressed with how carefully she built her arguments to tear down barriers to women's equality. As many of your viewers probably know, her first groundbreaking case was representing a man who was denied the right to take a tax deduction for the care of his widowed mother, something that would have been available to him if he had been a woman. So Ruth understood early on that she needed to make the case to primarily judges who were white and male in the federal court system and the state system. And so she was so deliberative in building her case and making clear that her interpretation of the 14th Amendment applied to sex as well as race, and that therefore courts should be looking at any kind of disadvantage or disfavor in the law, either for men or women, based solely on sex with a very high degree of scrutiny. And when she was appointed by President Carter to the Circuit Court in D.C., she was an incredibly effective judge in working with colleagues like then Judge Scalia. And so her legal work, her litigation, her judicial experience all suggested to me, when a vacancy opened up when Bill was just starting his first term, that he should take a hard look at Judge Ginsburg. And it was, as you might imagine, a heavily contested position. There were many people who were putting forth other very qualified potential candidates. But I arranged for the judge to come see Bill on a Sunday afternoon in the White House. And, you know, she basically was kind of snuck in, not to raise any unnecessary attention. And from the moment they sat down and started talking about the law and the Constitution, I could tell that they had hit it off. And certainly after that conversation, Bill said, "I really get what you're talking about. She'd be incredible on the Supreme Court." And so at the end, after all of his consideration, he appointed her.
Let me ask you this, and I ask you this as a former senator. Is there anything that your colleagues, the Democratic colleagues in the Senate, can do to stop what seems to be happening? Or is this the fait accompli? Is Donald Trump going to manage to get his nominee through?
Well, I think, first of all, it depends upon who the nominee is. And all nominees, as we know, go through a gauntlet of examination and questioning. Obviously, the votes seem to be there for whoever is nominated, but unpredictable things have happened in the past. My point to my former colleagues and others who have asked me is that we need to make it very clear what's at stake in this choice. I don't want it to be seen just as a partisan fight, Trump versus Democrats in the Senate and all of the drama that goes with that. I want people to understand what's at stake for them and their lives. And first and foremost, that's healthcare. The Trump administration, the Republican senators under McConnell have been trying to get rid of the Affordable Care Act for several years. They've tried and failed, but they never gave up their lawsuits against the law trying to undermine and even eliminate it. So that will be heard, currently scheduled in the Supreme Court right after the election. And this new justice will take part, most likely, in those deliberations. And what we're looking at is the end of the Affordable Care Act, but more than that, the end of the guarantee that all people with pre-existing conditions will be able to access affordable quality health care. We're going to see a real surge in people with pre-existing conditions because of the chronic after effects of COVID-19 for the people who have suffered it and now are reporting about heart problems, fatigue, and other things. So if you just take that one issue, and of course there are so many more, regulating, the environment and our clean air and our water and the climate crisis and so much else, to obviously say nothing about corporate power and women's choice and money in politics, all which I think have really set our country on the wrong track. That's going to affect every American. One or more of those issues will. So I think the Democrats in the Senate have an opportunity to really try to educate the public.
Let me ask you one other question on this. If the shoe were on the other foot, Republicans argue that the Democrats would be doing the same exact thing. Do you believe that to be true? That the Democrats, if they had the power, would be trying to ram through their nominee?
I don't believe that, and here's why. I think that the Democrats were so shocked, and understandably so, at the blatant abuse of the Senate rules and processes when they refused to allow President Obama to appoint a replacement for Justice Scalia 10 months before the next election, that there is within the Democratic caucus in the Senate a real fear that all bets are off, that there is no rule of law, there is no due process, there are no norms or principles governing anything anymore under the Trump and Mitch McConnell regime. So I think there would be a very significant discussion within the Democratic caucus as to whether it was good for the country to throw it into another partisan fight, 40 days before such a consequential election. Now, I can't predict how that would come out, but I think I know my former colleagues and others who are now serving well enough to know that it would have given them pause. They would not be demonstrating, the lust for power and domination that we have seen from McConnell, to the point where even colleagues who said, absolutely, we would not do this if it were to happen again, have clearly caved to the pressure to nominate and try to confirm someone quickly.
I want to turn to your now legendary Beijing speech from 25 years ago, but I have to ask one more question on politics, which is, you mentioned 40 days out. I have to. I get paid to do that.
That's right.
Yeah. But it's interesting to me. You have hard-earned experience running against Donald Trump. What advice have you given Joe Biden about the upcoming debate and about the next 40 days?
Well, I've given, my best advice about dealing with someone who literally will lie about anything and everything with a straight face, with impunity, who has a presence on the stage unlike anything that former Vice President Biden has ever, or any of us have ever dealt with. So be prepared, and be prepared not just to, talk about what you're running on, why you believe you're best positioned to really move our country forward, deal with all the crises from COVID to the economy to racial injustice and everything else. But know that you've got to figure out before you get on that stage how you're going to deal with the showmanship, the entertainment value, the smirking, the eyebrow raising, the shrugging, the whole physical presence of your opponent. And I know that Joe is well aware of these things because a number of the people who prepared me for my debates are helping him as well. You know, it's unlike any experience anybody, whether you're on the Republican or the Democratic side, have had, because it used to be that at some point in a process like debates, if you were engaging in just outright falsehoods, the moderator, your opponent, would make that clear. But when you're dealing with someone who lies with abandon and often doesn't even know what he's saying or the implications of it, you have to stay focused on the message you're trying to convey to the tens of millions of Americans who will be tuning in. It takes an enormous amount of preparation and concentration to pull that off, as I know very well. But I think Joe has demonstrated a real sense of discipline and commitment in this campaign that I think will put him in very good position for the debates.
Beijing, 25 years ago. Spend a minute talking about the purpose of that speech, and then we can talk a little bit about how far women have come and how far they have not come. I really do recommend everyone go onto the Atlantic website or pick up the print copy of the Atlantic and read the piece that Secretary Clinton has written about this. But for those people who haven't read this yet, set the stage a little bit and talk about what you were trying to do 25 years ago.
Well, the conference was the fourth in a series of gatherings globally that the UN sponsored around women's issues. And it was in Beijing. And the idea behind it was to try to get agreement among 189 countries about a platform for action that would try to demonstrate very clearly what was at stake for women and to set forth frameworks for nations and the world at large to follow in making legislative and regulatory changes that would enhance the rights, opportunity, and participation of girls and women. I thought that was a critical issue for the United States because even 25 years ago, we understood that countries that value girls and women are more likely to be stable, more likely to be democracies, more likely to be prosperous, not posing national security challenges to our country and our allies. We also believed that the United States had an obligation to stand up for human rights around the world, and that we needed to make absolutely clear that when we talked about human rights, we were, of course, talking about women's rights. That was not taken for granted 25 years ago. So
I want you to explain that to the youth. I really want you to explain that because it sounds obvious today, but why was that controversial? And I ask that sincerely. Why was that a controversy that you were going to say that?
Well, I think, human rights had always been viewed as, primarily defending the freedom and the autonomy and all of what we think of as rights, like freedom of expression and of assembly, against authoritarian regimes, against war criminals. And of course, the United States had been on the forefront of standing up for those rights. And it was something that wasn't really a topic of conversation that women were often subjected to other forms of discrimination and neglect and oppression that didn't fit into pre-existing categories. If women were denied education, where did that fit into the human rights lexicon? Girls not being permitted to go to school or being taken out of school after third or fourth grade. What about mothers dying in childbirth because, trying to provide adequate medical care was not seen as a right? So we thought that it was time to make the case that human rights and women's rights were the same, so that it was no longer an ancillary conversation that would be held on the margins of human rights conferences and conventions and the like. And so when the UN invited me to come, I was determined to go, but there was a lot of opposition. There was opposition because clearly, China was a human rights abuser in our view, and they often imprisoned people who were protesting for greater rights. They often absolutely cracked down on the press if there was any kind of effort to communicate more freely, and you can go on and think about all of the problems that we were considering. Eventually, we were able to get agreement within the administration and disregard Republican members who said, no, don't go to this conference. It's anti-family, because anything that promotes women, in their view, by definition, is anti-family, as opposed to, my view, which is that promoting women is actually the way you strengthen families and communities. So I was able to go, but I want to just do a quick segue to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because you say, talk to young people. When I was a young woman, I could not even get a credit card in my own name. The fact that I could get a credit card by the time I became a little older, in my mid to late 20s, was because of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the cases that she was bringing. I couldn't have gotten a mortgage without being allied to a husband or some other man. So, the kinds of rights we're talking about in our own country were limited for women, even when I was young in the 60s and the 70s coming up. So Beijing was on a global stage because, of course, so many of the deprivations that we were concerned about were truly matters of life and death, not credit cards, but they were on a continuum of the ways in which families, communities, societies, governments really limited the rights and opportunities that girls and women had.
Right. In the 30 seconds we have left, talk about the work that you believe still needs to be done. You talk about, in this piece for The Atlantic, you talk about the power deficit.
Right. Yeah, I mean, now I look back, and yes, we've made progress in education and healthcare in particular, but not as much as we should have made in business and the economy, or in politics and government, or in national security and peace. And what I've concluded, as I write in the article, is that naming and claiming rights is no longer enough. You have to have the power to actually deliver on those rights. And I think that has to be the next real movement as women around the world move into more positions of responsibility and figure out ways to open more doors, drop down more ladders, change more laws, create more room, and have the power to actually implement those changes if we're going to continue to see progress, as I hope we will, in the next 25 years.
Again, you can find Hillary Rodham Clinton's latest piece in The Atlantic this month on our website, in our print magazine. And Secretary Clinton, thank you very, very much for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Jeff. It's great to talk to you again.
The Atlantic Festival is brought to you through the generous support of Facebook, Genentech, Hewlett Packard Enterprise, Walton Family Foundation, Allstate, Eli Lilly and Company, U.S. Bank, AARP, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, ExxonMobil, John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, Nestle Waters North America, and PayPal. Please welcome Atlantic staff writer Shirley Lee.
Balancing parenting and work is difficult during the best of times, but a global pandemic introduces challenges none of us could have expected. I am pleased to be joined by Ayesha Curry, the entrepreneur, philanthropist, and best-selling author of The Seasoned Life, whose latest cookbook, The Full Plate, features recipes for parents helping to provide flavorful meals while juggling work with childcare. Ayesha, thank you so much for being here with us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Of course. So, Ayesha, I know you have a lot going on at the moment. Your book is on shelves this week, and you just announced that you're starting a production company. But I want to focus on life at home first. So, obviously, you and Stefan have become parenting role models for so many. What are the biggest challenges, would you say, as a parent during the pandemic?
I would definitely say life is chaotic right now, as I'm sure it is for everyone, parent or not. But for us, I feel like our parenting style has always been, especially now, a little bit relaxed. Our kids are still young. They're 8, 5, and 2. And so for us, it's really been taking this time to kind of lean into just nurturing them as human beings. And, the education is there, and we make sure they're in school and they're doing the things, but if things aren't working out that day, we just take it one step at a time. It's more about leaning into their personalities during this time and making sure that, their mental health is right where it needs to be, because I feel like things are chaotic and just so unpredictable right now. And so really just checking in with them, making sure, again, that humanity part of them is intact and good to go, and that they're just good people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for you personally, what keeps you going? Have you had any moments where you felt tested by everything going on?
Well, I'm not going to lie, a good glass of wine usually does the trick in the evenings, and that morning cup of coffee. But I would say, again, things are so unpredictable right now. And so there's moments where you want to cry and then you start laughing because you're like, what is actually happening? There's days when you're sad, and there's days when you are, finding the silver linings and trying to just enjoy that extra togetherness that a lot of us have been able to have. But I would say for me, what keeps me going is leaning into those emotions. So not burying them. So I don't have a pile high rug of emotionalness. And so for me, it's letting the moment happen and then letting it pass. It keeps me sane.
Got it. Well, now, The Full Plate focuses on nurturing your family through food, and it's packed with recipes that highlight how family dinners encourage happy and a strong family life. So what inspired this approach for this cookbook, especially after your first?
Yeah, I would say that there's so many layers to how the book came about, and just the meaning behind it and what I hope it brings to people. Its inception was around the chaos of life, to be honest. It's been almost 4 years since my first cookbook, and I said I didn't want to do a second one until I felt inspired or ready to dig deep into it. Because what's in the book, it's there forever when you publish something and it's in print. And so I wanted it to be quality and make sense and have meaning. And so for me, it's a reflection of the chaos of life, but going back to my core values of making sure that, I'm getting my family around the table and encouraging people to do the same, because it really is the foundation for, healthy relationships, communicating with your kids, your friends, your family, whatever it may be, And I feel like a good meal does that. It brings people together. It's the whole reason why I love food. It's such a vessel for communication and change and just happiness. And so for me, being able to do that in a quick and easy way where I wasn't, giving up on the quality of the meal and the flavor, that umami. Like I wanted something that could be quick, 15, 20, 30 minutes, get the dinner on the table, but it's still like delicious and everybody's happy. And so that's kind of how the book came about. There's also great cocktails in there. I feel like every meal prep should start with a cocktail around dinner time. And so that's really the focus of the book, is dinner and drinks. There's a couple of desserts in there, but that's really where I lean into the meal, is with dinner. So I want it to be a reflection of that.
Speaking of umami, I was curious, what are the kids' favorite meals from the book? Because I would suspect that they really like the umami sauce.
Yes. So that's kind of my special, I call it my secret sauce to the kids. It's super simple though, as you can see in the book. But I would say Hannon, my 2-year-old, is who loves that the most. He loves to just dip things, and so the chicken bites with the umami sauce is perfect for him. I would say my daughter Ryan, our middle child, is 5, and she really, really loves any sort of pasta. So the crab bucatini is her jam. The umami mac and cheese, she loves that. But with her, she really eats anything, so it's an easy bet with her. And then our oldest, Riley, loves like your traditional meal. So a starch, lots of veg, a protein. And so she actually enjoys the cherry lamb loin in there, and any sort of fish. So I have a delicious poached halibut with an orange beurre blanc, and she like loves it. That's something I make on special occasions when I have a little bit more time. But yeah, I lucked out with my kids. They're not very picky.
That's good to hear. So I want to pivot to talking about a foundation that you and Steph launched recently called Eat, Learn, Play. I understand that one of the goals of Eat, Learn, Play is to end childhood hunger in underserved communities across the Oakland and Alameda counties in California. So what steps have you and the foundation taken during the pandemic to carry out this objective?
Yeah, so we launched Eat, Learn, Play in July of 2019, so just a little bit over a year. And we were going to slow roll it, ease our way in, and then the pandemic hit, and we quickly had to learn on our feet and rally the troops and be boots on the ground. And what I came to realize, what we've always set out to do is be the connective tissue between people who are already, organizations that are already doing amazing things, and help to amplify that. And so what I found in the midst of this pandemic is people have really stepped up to the plate. And I've never seen a truer sense of community in my life. I feel like what I've witnessed through the work we're doing with Eat, Learn, Play is what community is. And we were able to come together and create this full circle effect where restaurants have been able to reopen in Oakland because they're providing the food for the families in the community, which in turn, opens up job opportunity for people in the Oakland community. And so it's been this full circle effect. And our hope is that people look at the model we've implemented into Oakland and take that into their own communities and amplify. Because I've always said it really does take a village, and there's nothing wrong with that. And no matter who you are, and I just feel like people now more than ever need the help. And we've just been so grateful to be able to lend a helping hand during this time. And so we've had to scale quickly, and I'm glad we've been able to keep up with the demand. But obviously, it doesn't seem like there's light right now at the end of the tunnel for when this thing is going to be over. And so we're just going to keep trucking along, and we're so grateful to all of our partners for making sure that, we're able to keep up with everything.
Yeah, that leads me to my next question. I understand that Eat, Learn, Play has been really successful. I mean, you guys have delivered over 7 million meals and worked with 130 restaurants in the area. But what are the biggest challenges to sustaining that success, especially now?
I would say the biggest challenge, honestly, is how quickly the need is expanding. And again, it's great that we've been able to keep up with it, but when you look at the numbers, and like we don't need a applaud or like a pat on the back. It's the numbers to me are a reflection that there's more work that needs to be done to get to a place where we don't have to be doing this. And so, if anything, it's sad to me that it's as quickly as it is, because that means that there's more people that need help. And for me, I feel like, again, making sure that we have strong partnerships has been really key into making sure that we're able to keep a tight ship and run it smoothly. And so, again, just super grateful. But I would say the biggest challenge thus far has been making sure that we're adhering to all of the COVID rules while making sure that we're getting people their meals and their school supplies and all of the things that they need. And so I would say that's been in my opinion, the biggest hurdle. But I think we've done a good job thus far.
Now, I wanted to talk to you about how this pandemic has also helped to expose deep cultural inequalities. And I understand that you have discussed the Black Lives Matter movement with your children, and that your oldest has been asking you questions about the protests in particular. So in such a close-knit family, do you like to be open with your children about such big issues? And how do you broach the subject of race with your 3 little ones?
Absolutely. That's a great question. We are definitely, we're going to tackle the conversations head on type of parents. I feel like, and I think a lot of millennial parents are feeling the same way. We were sort of raised where, you don't really speak, you're not spoken to, you're afraid to kind of ask the questions. And I just didn't want that for the kids. And so we're very open with them when it comes to all the social injustices that are happening, because I truly believe that not sugarcoating is like the first step to seeing change. And so for us, just instilling our values in them from a young age and making them aware of what's going on so that they can be the change that we want to see has been really, really, really important. And so I feel like no child is too young to understand what's going on in their own backyard. So.
Absolutely. Well, now going back to the full plate, just to wrap up, you incorporate flavors from your Black and Jamaican heritage, and you consulted with your relatives on ingredients for a variety of recipes. So I just wanted to ask, how can food play a role in teaching children about their culture? Why is it important to do so?
Oh, man. Well, as my oldest runs out of the room, guys, this is real life here, okay? This is pandemic living right here. But I would say, oh man, I just think about myself right now in the midst of everything that's going on and not being able to see certain family and not having those traditions that I'm so used to, being able to prepare the food that I grew up with and that my grandma made for me and having that cultural side of me has been everything. Like for my mental health, for feeling that sense of comfort. It's crazy how food can truly change and shape your emotions and take you back to, the happiest of moments or wherever. Any dish can take you back to the moment. And so for me, like I'm Jamaican, and I love oxtail and curry goat and rice and peas and escovitch fish, and having that knowledge and that background that's been passed down for me to be able to prepare that during this time has been everything. And so I think it's so important to make sure, no matter what your background is, that you're having that experience with your children and passing on that tradition. because again, food is such a vessel for so many different things. And so I just love how I'm able to share that story of my culture through food.
Absolutely. Well, then on that note, Ayesha, thank you so much for your time today. For everyone tuning in, you can get a copy of The Full Plate along with books by our other festival speakers at The Atlantic's page on bookshop.org.
Perfect. Don't forget to vote, everyone.
Next, Atlantic staff writer Ed Yong.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Ed Yong. I've been reporting on the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic for The Atlantic, and I am very pleased to introduce today someone who has been thinking about pandemic preparedness for a very long time. Bill Gates, thank you so much for being here. So, Bill, we last spoke about this topic in 2018, a very different time. You described then that pandemic preparedness was an area that shook your trademark optimism about the trajectory of the world. You said, boy, do we not have our act together. How do you feel about the way the pandemic has played out this year?
Well, sadly, I think the most pessimistic view of how unprepared we were has actually played out, particularly in the United States. And so with something that can grow exponentially, like infectious disease, a little bit of preparedness where you can act early, makes such a difference. And a few countries have distinguished themselves, but most countries have not.
And looking at how the US has fared, what has surprised you, and where do you see that we've gone wrong?
Well, the US had a lot of assets going into this. First of all, we weren't ground zero. China was ground zero. Then it moved over into Europe. And so the US had more time to get ready. The US has more PCR machines than, all the other countries. Per capita, we're very blessed with an expensive medical infrastructure. And we have groups like CDC and BARDA. So the US had done more to get ready than other countries had in advance. Now, there was some destaffing of these things under this administration, but even so, I would have expected us to get the commercial providers up and going, like South Korea or Germany or Australia did. The fact that that actually was made harder by FDA regulations, and that somebody actually thought the public health testing capacity, which actually was bungled, would have enough capacity, it was, it's really insane, which speaks to, just not getting the leadership to have a framework of what needed to be done. There were so many phone calls about we've got to get diagnostic capacity up and we have to get quick results. I participated in a lot of those calls, and yet to this day, that's just a complete mess.
Can you say more about that leadership piece, Bill? Because I think you're one of the few people who has had direct contact with the president and the administration about the matter of pandemic preparedness. You've tried to, as I understand it, emphasize the importance of this to them. What is your assessment of America's leaders and their response to this pandemic?
Well, you can look at the period before the epidemic hits and say, even though the U.S. didn't do a very good job, most other countries didn't. There were a few that had been hit by SARS or MERS that had a little bit of practice understanding, diagnosis, contact tracing is super important. So they're among the countries that did the best. So, I'd give the U.S. like a C-, but all countries, many would get an even worse grade of how ready they were before this thing hit. Mm-hmm. Then once it hits, I had a thing called the Seattle Flu Study, which was looking at all respiratory viruses. And because the study protocol didn't include coronavirus, we weren't really authorized, but the principal investigator decided to look and saw the first community spread of coronavirus here in the United States. And that should have set off such alarms to get the domestic testing to change the criteria of who got tested. This notion that the travel ban was some beneficial thing, that's just not true, because we didn't test those people. We didn't quarantine those people. And so then, after the pandemic starts, there hasn't been any coherence. Now, the R&D funding, I will say that, the BARDA money, the purchase agreements, that's where the U.S. actually does get the highest grade in the world. Europe hasn't funded nearly as much of that R&D, which is a global public good. Now, we need to complement that with funding the factories and the procurement for the global response, which the U.S. has been absent so far, but I'm still hopeful that if there's another supplemental bill, we'll get about $8 billion for international COVID activities into that bill.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the pandemic should change the way we think about global health? There's always been this sense of, richer developed nations like the US helping out developing ones. But in this crisis, many of the richest countries have fared appallingly, whereas many poorer ones from Senegal to Vietnam have actually done really well. Do you think that this is this should be cause for humility, a change in our approach?
Well, certainly humility is called for, because the damage, whether it's economic, educational, mental health, is so large. Other than a world war, this is the worst thing that's happened in over a century. And so we should all say, wow, we didn't understand about masks. We didn't understand about asymptomatics. Even the medical profession, we haven't taken understanding these different respiratory diseases quite as seriously as we should. So everyone has lessons here. And of course, as long as the pandemics, we mostly should focus on, okay, how do we get monoclonals done and available to everyone? How do we get the vaccine done? This looking back, a lot of that can be preserved for when we bring the thing to a close. The idea of which interventions work well, these trials, that's another area that has been such a mess with no leadership at all, that we're still confused about plasma. There probably are some drugs that have been missed. It was the only thing we actually have of significance is the UK trial that the foundation helped fund that showed dexamethasone as having a good result. You would have expected the US to get a lot going on to prove out other interventions.
And why do you think that the research on interventions has been so chaotic, is it fair to say?
Well, there's actually a question in the U.S. system of who's in charge of making sure that consistent trials get done. The FDA is just there to say at the end, okay, you did this well. They're not there to instigate trials. NIH is more on the research side. CDC is public health. BARDA is more a procurement thing. So actually, under that HHS umbrella, who is supposed to really orchestrate these trials is actually unclear. If you'd had particularly enlightened leadership of that and seen that as a priority between the various groups, including NIH, you could have done it well. The UK, in fact, although they have many things in this epidemic, even a few they did worse than the US, which is hard. In terms of organizing trials, they were very coherent in having the common criteria of patient recruitment and coming up mostly with negative results. I mean, we thought more approved medicines. We did this library of medicines, the pandemic reframe library. We were disappointed that there's few enough antivirals in there, that remdesivir showed modest benefit and two other antivirals are still being pushed forward. although that's been a bit slow. We need to have a gigantic library of antivirals available, for the next time, and then get trials that give very quick results on which of those have an impact.
Absolutely. So I totally agree that that better research on things like medical interventions is important. I think that one of the things the pandemic has highlighted, though, is the relevance of social interventions too. The pandemic has so much widened inequities, both around the world and domestically, between rich and poor. It has disproportionately hit Black and Latinx and indigenous communities. How are you thinking about those disparities and what needs to be done to address them for this pandemic and for future ones?
Yeah, it is kind of unbelievable that every dimension of inequity has been exacerbated here. And our goalkeepers report that is done in the framework of these sustainable development goals, and we do that every year around this UN General Assembly. Every other year, that's been this positive story of gradual progress. Less children dying, less malnutrition, longer lifespans. And, so we get to say to the world, hey, pay attention to that steady progress, and let's look at the heroes and the exemplars, and let's drive that even faster. This report had to deliver the news that if you only look at COVID deaths, you're actually missing the scale of the setback, because it's also routine immunization, malaria, getting HIV medicines, and things are so disrupted that even gathering the numbers for that was very, very difficult. But, we dropped our routine immunization levels by over 14% that we've spent the last 25 years pulling that together. So there's going to have to be a stronger equity agenda, hopefully on a global basis, once we get out of this, because the developing countries haven't had the fiscal resources like the United States. They don't have as much of their economy with office workers that can be done over the internet. Even though their younger age populations have meant the actual death rate in these countries has been below the rich countries.
Okay, and in terms of the results from the goalkeepers report, there's some. It does make for very galling reading. I'd love to know, which among the various findings there, what's really sticking out for you as being a significant problem that we need to put a lot of energy into trying to address?
Well, it was interesting how hard it was to gather the data. Mostly when we gather data, we rely on the fact that if we sample countries over time, they're all progressing down the same path. Here, you have very different government policies, and the spread of the disease is so different in different countries. So our error bars on the facts we were putting forward were even larger than they normally are. So that was very concerning. Things like the extreme poverty number, where 37 million people driven into extreme poverty. That's really just gut-wrenching, because the idealistic view is that that's something we should get rid of altogether. And yet, I do worry that the pandemic, because it did hit rich countries, their generosity actually might be less. Most of the time when we talk about infectious diseases, our problem is that the world doesn't pay attention to malaria or TB. Here, because people care so much about getting the vaccines, they're actually, saying, okay, we should, maybe be even less generous. And in the case of the vaccine, use the rich countries' ability to pay more and have it all be allocated to them. And so not only does the pandemic last longer in developing countries, the kind of generosity that historically has helped might even go down.
And do you see those kind of inequities also playing out in the US? Again, going back to some of the social inequities we've talked about, I guess one of my concerns is that the groups that have been disproportionately burdened by this pandemic and by this long-standing history of systemic discrimination will be last in line to receive the vaccine when it comes out? Like, what work should and can be done to reduce that inequity back home?
Well, that allocation algorithm, one way to help with that is to have so much volume that you're not making super hard trade-offs. And so, the vaccine expertise and the foundation, we're trying to help with that. And if multiple get approved, actually the volumes could be quite large. We should look at the risk levels, and based on that, you would say that various inner city communities, including Blacks and Hispanics, would have somewhat higher priority. So that algorithm, which the CDC should be getting people to sign up, that saying, hey, I want the vaccine, and giving some of this criteria. The same way that we wanted a CDC website for people seeking a test, here we should have a CDC website for people who are saying they're willing to take the vaccine, where you understand their age and ethnicity and location, and then you can take that and come up with what the equitable priority ranking should be. I'm not seeing that sense of gathering the data to come up with those algorithms. So it's kind of bizarre that you have these over-optimistic projections that the vaccine will come soon. But when you read this 67-page report about how it's distributed, it doesn't actually concretely identify the criteria or how the information is going to be gathered to do this, to do the prioritization. And so, it's just like everything with this, the vacuum of leadership and the unwillingness of people to step forward because it'll say, oh, this thing's a mess. We need to fill in these answers there. I see the India plan for vaccine distribution as more concrete than what's here in the U.S.
It does seem like poor data collection is a problem that has plagued the US throughout this entire pandemic. There have been long-standing questions about the quality of the information that we're getting about what is happening within this country. Do you see that as a problem? Do you think is the nature of the data gap surprising to you?
Well, the progress on overall health statistics, this thing called the Global Burden of Disease, which is hosted at IHME at the University of Washington, that we've been involved in helping Chris Murray and his team build that up. The health statistics in the U.S. are better today than they've ever been. In fact, it's fascinating to go and browse and look at gender differences and changes over time or difference between different states. In the dynamic of the epidemic, we've fallen behind a little bit, and we don't have quite as many standards of how things are reported. And a little bit, CDC got interfered with for their normal function. But the U.S., can be an exemplar on this. The push towards digitization and has, thank goodness, because of it helps you connect up to telemedicine. It's gotten a big boost from the epidemic, that paper records are much harder to move around, and so slowly but surely the U.S. on the overall data and even the digital health records, I do think will be an exemplar there.
You mentioned the IHME, and I wanted to ask you about this because the model that they created has been criticized by other epidemiologists and statisticians who, certainly in the early phases of the pandemic, underestimating the toll that it would take over time. And I know the model was heavily influential in the administration's thinking about this. Do you have any thoughts about that contribution, especially given your foundation's support of that group?
Well, I think modeling has certain limitations. The people behind the 538 website did some really good, even a kind of a cartoon thing to show how just picking a few parameters that are unknown can cause wildly varying results. The imperial model actually gave very big numbers, but of course, it assumed that people didn't change their behavior at all. They kept going to work and everything. And so, that was kind of an upper bound to get politicians' attention. I think that was very valuable, even though, of course, people did sometimes voluntarily, sometimes under government mandate, change their behavior. All these models are not perfect because there's so many unknown parameters. I have a modeling group inside the foundation called the Institute for Disease Modeling. And of course, we fund IHME. I do think those models have been helpful. If you look at their accuracy in a 2 to 4 week time frame, it's been pretty good. Now, 2-3 months out, which is what you really want to know, is a lot harder. And so, for example, right now, we have a divergence between the models that do think this is a seasonal disease and that people will be more lax in their behavior. So IHME, they forecast a very tough fall in the United States. Now, I have to say, they forecast the resurgence in Europe, which the other people who were more optimistic about the fall did not forecast that resurgence, which probably is its laxity and seasonality causing that rebound. And so even though, we're not totally certain, it looks like we're headed for a very tough fall. IHME as a forecaster is a little bit different than them, gathering the data for the history, which is their main thing. But the U.S. government didn't even have a plan on which modelers to work with and how to work with them. So I've taken, the governor of New York called me up and said, hey, how many ventilators do I need? And, thank goodness the IHME model gave him a much more realistic view than some of the other oversimplistic models that he was dealing with.
So you and your foundation have shaped a lot of the research, the funding space, the sort of thinking around global health. Looking at what has happened with the pandemic this year, with the benefit of hindsight, do you see any mistakes? Do you think, would you do anything differently in the future? How are you thinking about how to learn lessons from what has happened with COVID-19?
Well, I'm hopeful that the things that I and other people put forward even before 2015, but in a very clear way, there was a post-Ebola, post-West Africa Ebola discussion, where we talked about doing the equivalent of war games, having the diagnostics people able to scale up, having antiviral libraries, getting generic vaccine platforms, like hopefully what the RNA platform will become, where 5 to 10 years from now, it will have low cost and high scalability, which it sadly right at the moment, it's not as strong as some of the other platforms in that respect. So I think the prescription, is still the same as it was before this pandemic hit. And, the cost of doing it, is in the tens of billions, not hundreds of billions. So compared to, say, defense budgets, this is not a gigantic additional burden. And in fact, if it's done appropriately, it will drive progress in things that will help us with diseases that are here today. Amazingly, BioNTech, who's Pfizer's partner, they're doing vaccines for cancer, and that's their primary business model. But, our foundation partners with them because some of that work of making vaccines can help for the equity agenda around infectious diseases. So I think, we can be ready for the next time so that if something that's not much worse than this hits, the impact would be, 5% of what it's been here. And I do think we can use that for making progress on other diseases, and that the fiscal trade-off involved is actually pretty modest.
And I've got to ask, do you think that we will learn that lesson? The last time we talked about this, it was about whether these discussions which have already been had, these warnings that were already sounded, will actually translate into action. They didn't. In large part, do you think that this crisis will actually spur introspection?
Yes. The lack of working on this was that people, didn't think about it. Infectious diseases, mostly we've made so much progress that rich countries kind of ignore them. And here, because it's hit and cost trillions of dollars. I mean, what I'm talking about as the preparedness, as a percentage of the damage this thing done is, it's not even close to 1%. And it has affected everyone in every rich country. I mean, there's basically no country that hasn't had very big damage. So yes, we are not so blithe that this time, this is not just Ebola, which hit 3 countries in Western Africa. This is a tragedy. If you care about education, if you care about race, if you care about mental health, if you care about gender, if you care about government budgets, having money to do things that you want government to do, that, this is cost so much. I put $3 trillion in my TED Talk in 2015. By the time this is done, we'll be at over $20 trillion of total economic cost. So, I was, way understating it there, even though when I said the term $3 trillion, I was like, wow, that is absolutely so gigantic. So yes, it takes rich people getting sick. It takes rich economies being affected. But when that happens, the world gets together. And thank goodness the state of science is such that building a PCR diagnostics that can be done at a mega testing level where you test, 20% of the country every week. That technology can be done. Some come out of GMO seed sequencing, which is extremely high volume. The vaccine platform can be done. The antivirals can be done. The monoclonals can be done. The tracking to see things earlier, that can be done. So we're very lucky. If this had hit 20 years ago, the state of biology, digital infrastructure, you would have had to, just pray that it didn't come back. Now, we do have all the things that we need so that a pathogen like this wouldn't be a big deal in the future.
Well, I hope you're right, Bill. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. Really appreciate it.
Great to talk to you.
Thank you to all our speakers and journalists for the conversations we heard tonight. And thank you all for watching. If you like what you saw, please support our journalism by subscribing to The Atlantic. We really appreciate your support and your time with us today. Tomorrow, we're back with Ibram Kendi, Samantha Bee, and more. Good night.
The ambitious journalism you see here tonight and across print and online can't be made without your support. Please become a subscriber today. You'll get unlimited access to the incredible journalism of theatlantic.com, 10 issues a year of our unrivaled print magazine, and much, much more.